Okay, I'm working on my background, and I initially put down a dark background and it was just too somber, too dead. So I chipped it all out. It was mostly down here. And now I've mixed up about 6 or 7 colors. Some violets, some yellows, and some greens that I've dulled back with a little bit of red. So I'm just going to start laying down color. Okay, I've mixed up my background, my last border color, and I chose a color that was in my California poppy leaf range. And I didn't want it to be too dark because I didn't want it to be so somber and confining. So how I found out the amount I needed, if you go online to Art Resin, they have a calculator that's great. So I just put in my measurements and it tells me how many ounces or milliliters I need. So I mixed in a larger cup, and now I'm going to transfer it to a smaller cup to pour it easier. Okay, at this point, all my resin is on the front of the piece. And I'm going to give it about 3 days before I start sanding it. But in the meantime, I'm going to work on the back. So I've gone back with some acetone and a paper towel, cleaned up whatever blemishes I had. There was blue tape protecting this outer edge because I had painted the black along the edge and I didn't want it to bleed over. So I peeled off the blue tape, cleaned up the back, and the next phase is going to be gluing my little mounting blocks on my board. So I've been using this Loctite product and I like it. Everything's stayed on the wall, but there's got to be a better way to do this because for the little bit I use, I squeeze it out and then it hardens. 3 months later, I can't get it open, even though we've cleaned the threads. So I have to put a hole in it. I mean, it's a nightmare. If anyone's got any great ideas, I'll take it. Anyway, so these little blocks are just a hardwood. You don't want particle board because you don't want these things to ever pull out or break with the weight of this. Because this is pretty heavy. I'm going to say, I don't know, 15 pounds? I don't know, I should weigh it. So just some little eye bolts, and they're pre-drilled, screwed in, and then glued in there. I've been told the rule of thumb is to take your height, divide it by 3. That makes this is 12 inches, so it's 4 inches down and 1 inch in. Because I don't want this up against my edge. I don't really want it to show, so I come in 1 inch. And then the bottom pieces, they don't need the eye bolts. They're just little blocks that are set 1 inch in on either side, so that when it's sitting on the wall, it's flush with the wall, no, parallel to the wall instead of at an angle. After I get these glued on, the next day after they've had some time to sit, dry, I'm going to take my leftover green, I mean it could be any of my colors, but whatever I think is going to go on the back, make it, add a lot of clear to it, and this port I don't want to cover up my signature on the back, so it's going to be a pale color. I do this on all the pieces, and then when everything's done, I'll go back in and put in my wire. Okay, I'm going to work on the back, which I have mounted my little wooden mounting blocks. Before I can pour resin on the back, I tape off my outer perimeter on the front because the resin from the back is going to go down the side edges, and it'll leave a lot of little raised bumps that are kind of cool, but I don't want them. So any kind of bumpy edge, the tape will pull it off, and if there's anything left over, I can sand it off. Because I have not sanded this yet. It's going to look a lot different. So as you can see, I've got some little plastic cones. You buy those on Amazon. And they keep it raised up because the resin is going to drip onto your back surface and you don't want it sticking to your table. I have raised it so that, and hopefully it's level enough. Pretty good. All right, pretty good. I haven't put in my hardener yet, but right now this is my leftovers from, all my greens I threw in there. I threw in my yellow in there. And it's not real dark, really, when you look at it with the plastic fork. So it should be nice and transparent still. I just like to finish off the back of the piece with something other than a stupid white board. I'm using a cup from Tap Plastics because For this size, I have to use 10 ounces of material. Now you can use a spreader. You can also buy spreaders throughout art resin, and they have little grooves cut in them, so when you're spreading, you're not spreading a big wave, you're doing little waves. But I also use my fingers. Okay, it's good to have one hand clean. Okay, we've got to the sanding point. Many of the artists who are doing this similar technique don't sand their pieces down. They'll leave the little cells that have the resin in it a little bit uneven or a little higher in one than another or low. But I like the smooth, flat, glossy look. So I don't know if you can see it, but you can see that there's low spots. There's spots where this color, background color, has gone over and infiltrated this leaf, which is okay because it's a darker, it's putting the leaf back more in the background. But I still want this to be smooth and flat. So a lot of wires are covered up, especially the wires that are underneath the black border. Once I sand the piece, I'm going to put a clear coat of resin on top of it. But while I'm handling this piece after it's sanded, I am not going to have with my bare hands. I'm always going to have gloves on because I don't want to leave any hand oil on that copper. In years, the oxidation will show up even underneath the resin. I've got some pieces that have done that. So things I need a random orbital sander. You can probably use a regular, back and forth sander. Probably doesn't matter. The good thing about the orbital is that it gives the copper a very sparkly appearance. I'm going to be using just 80 grit. That's just fine because I am not going to polish this piece. I've tried polishing in the past and all it does is a lot more work, and in the final process it winds up where there's little tiny micro dots, micro bubbles in the piece, and the sanded material, the dust, will get embedded in those little exposed micro bubbles, and it looks like you have little tiny galaxies of dust. So I like sanding it and then one coat of clear coat and it's done. So the orbital sander is hooked up to my shop vac to take on all of the dust. I always work with my mask and my particle filters. You need to have eye protection if you're not wearing glasses. I wear my glasses and I will also wear my goggles just so that I can see the progress of these wires getting sanded, because you have to be so careful. If you sand all the way through, there's no turning back. You can't fix it. So you're so nervous this whole time. I also will wear ear protection and a few towels. I'll be sanding this on a towel and I will be wiping it down periodically to get rid of the dust with the other towel. I've got about an hour and 15 minutes of sanding time on this so far. I've got probably another hour to go. The most difficult part is this outer edge. So when you're designing your piece, just know that that's going to be a tough place to sand, and if you've got a lot of wires like this, it's going to be really dicey. So a lot of my wires are already exposed. I have a few that you can just barely see that they're not quite exposed. But I have to be very careful because I don't want to be sanding these any farther down. You can see the wires get very pink and they get nice and wide, but they change sizes. So you just don't want to over sand. I finished sanding. It took about 2 hours and about 9 sanding discs. The most important thing about sanding is sanding on a cool day. You don't want to be in the sun. You don't want this to warm up because your resin is going to soften when you're sanding. Oh, what a mess. Don't want to do that. When you are sanding, you will find that you are not able to really sand all the wires equally. For instance, you can see here how thick this wire is because, it's raised up somehow, whereas this one, this part of it's very thin, and here you can barely even see the exposed wire. So I just go back, because there's like a thin film of resin on it, and I will just scrape off that little tiny film. And you kind of rough up the wire because you want it to be as abraded as the rest of the wires to make them have that sparkle. You'll also see that, wow, it looks like hell. It's very dull. The colors have gone flat. Where the colors aren't flat, that means my resin was very low in the swimming pools. But when I pour my top coat, because it's self-leveling, in theory, all of these low spots should fill in. There's also some spots where I exposed some air bubbles that I didn't delete with the torch. So I go back in with a little pin, dig out the bubbles, use my canned air, get that dust out, because in the sanding process, the dust accumulated in the little tiny holes or little tiny crevices. So you don't really want that dust in there because that is just a big white circle. So it's all cleaned out. The last stage is putting on my top coat. And I do this in my shed that's, I'd say dust, well, there's less dust there than here in my house. You want to do it where your temperature is 74 to 84, so I heat up my shed. And if you don't have good temperature control for the 12 hours or so you want it to be curing, you're going to get a weird, kind of moraine surface. Now, if you get a bad surface, like if I screwed up somehow, or if I couldn't get all the dust out, I can go back and sand it down again, not as far as I am here, but rough up my surface with an 80 grit sandpaper and pour another top coat.